Okay, so good evening, everyone. I just, on behalf of the Ontario Eventing Association, the OEA, I'd like to welcome you to the first of our 3 webinars with Katie Wood of the Equestrian Physio. My name is Winnie Chu, and I am one of the board of directors for the OEA. And this free event is generously sponsored by the OEA Adult Rider Fundraising Initiative to support our very important adult riders. As everyone know, as we age, we have different, needs and different aches and pains as when we are 18 years old. So we specifically wanted Katie to provide some insights regarding adult riders and their challenges. So without further much ado, I would turn the presentation over to Katie. If the people have already submitted questions, and during the presentation, if you have any questions, please put that into the chat box, and then I will moderate, and we can do the Q&A at the very end of the presentation. Does that sound good?
Yeah, no, that's great. Perfect. Well, thank you, Winnie. I'm just going to go ahead and pin myself. Take over, unpin you. There we go. And then give me 2 seconds, guys. I'm just going to rearrange my screen a little bit. Here we go. So if I'm looking over here, it's because that's where the Google chat lives, and then my notes are living over here. So that's kind of where we're at.
And also one thing, sorry, I just forgot. If anybody is comfortable with putting your face, having your camera on, that'll be great, because then if there's questions and answers, then we could refer to the person. That's all.
Exactly.
Thank you.
And that's the other thing too, is if you are an OEA member and you're looking at the bottom of your screen and it doesn't give you the option to turn your camera on or turn your mic on, put your hand up and Winnie will promote you to a contributor within the call so that you have access to do that, because just non-OEA members just got a view only link, but OEA members are going to hopefully be able to contribute and go back and forth in the Q&A section of this call. So you can go ahead and put your hand up or message Winnie, and she will promote you just so that you can have that interaction. Anyway, so welcome, guys. Thank you, Winnie, for that beautiful introduction. My name is Katie. I am a physiotherapist here in Ontario. I am a strength and conditioning coach. I am a previous eventer and horseback rider, and my mission is to help equestrians step into their identity as athletes, because I feel like something that I really discovered during my time as a physiotherapy student, and then through building my business and everything after that, is just noting what a massive gap there is in our industry when it comes to equestrians understanding how to treat and train themselves as athletes, and then being able to implement that. So I really try and bring forward, empowerment by giving riders that knowledge and the practice for them to build that strength themselves. And I know it's going to be a slow burn, and it is an uphill battle to try and shift the industry towards this new idea, but that is kind of my goal. So really brief about me. You guys don't need all of the list of everything I do, but previous OHTA member for many years. Before it was the OEA, it was the OHTA. So I haven't been for a while, but that's just because school was very expensive and I haven't competed in a little while. Did my undergrad and my master's at the University of Guelph, worked here in the area of Guelph as a veterinary assistant with the Key Pownell Equine Services, if anyone knows, for a few years before I decided to sort of shift gears and go to physiotherapy school. I also do equine rehab, so I treat both the horse and riders, and that's a really fun kind of dyad to be able to do, because a lot of the time you're treating the horse with something that you noted, the rider has a restriction that's impacting the horse has a restriction or something that's impacting the rider, and I'm kind of able to work within those. So that's really fun. And then, yes, I am a licensed physiotherapist here in Ontario. If anyone has any questions, Winnie's going to be trying to field questions a little bit, kind of interrupting me if something comes up that is useful for me to address before I move on. Otherwise, she's just going to be kind of taking notes of things. So you can just go ahead and throw those in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to apologize if my voice cracks halfway through this. I am getting over a cold, so I've got a massive cup of tea and honey here. Hopefully we can make it through this hour without my voice completely giving way. But if it does, or if I like have to mute myself for a minute for a coughing fit, that's why. I'm going to apologize there. So this is what I hope you guys are able to walk away with, that you have an understanding of why riders need to train like athletes, that you understand a little bit about what actually moves the needle. So like, what are the heavy hitters? What are, if you guys know the analogy of, if you take a jar and you fill it with big rocks and then little rocks and then sand, it's like, what are the big rocks? What are the big heavy needle movers? And then what are the things that don't matter as much? Because that is hard to separate when we're getting a lot of our information from like social media and such. We also want to touch on what eventing specifically brings to this, and that from the adult amateur standpoint, what masters athletes specifically need to be thinking about. We'll have some examples of what training programs can look like, and then we're going to go through some of those pre-submitted Q&As, as well as opening the floor to OEA members for you guys to kind of like bring whatever you got at me, and hopefully we can work through that a little bit. So hopefully that I'm not moving too fast for you guys, but this is kind of where I start. Whenever I am assessing a rider, whenever I am trying to get to the root of the problem, whenever I am looking at what, the way that I have in my head, what it takes to be an effective rider, I break it down into these 6 key components. And essentially, we're looking at, 5 things. And I'll dive into these a little bit more, but like 5 things that can technically be built out of the saddle, be built in a gym or in other ways. And then 1 thing that really just, you can only build it in the saddle. There's no other place to build it, right? When we break these into sections, the first is just strength. Like, are you strong enough to hold your position? Are you strong enough to absorb the forces that are coming up from the horse moving underneath you? Then we look at body awareness and control. Right? This is huge for knowing where your leg is, where your hand is, where your weight is in your seat, all of these things, how you're applying your aids, right? Do you know where your body is in space? And from the control piece, can you put it where you need it to be and hold it there? And then, of course, cardiovascular endurance, right? Really quick story on that one. My first prelim ever, that was kind of like my wake up call when it came to the rider fitness, is because like I, la-di-da'd through like pre-training and training for several seasons. And then I finally got up to prelim. And if anyone's made that jump, like it's probably one of the bigger jumps as you're moving up the levels. And I made it halfway around that prelim course at Dreamcast. And I was like, oh shit, I'm in trouble. Because I was completely gassed. And thankfully I had a really honest horse and we made it around. But that was my wake up call when I was like, I am not fit enough to be here. Someone should have told me that I wasn't fit enough to do that course before I got on it, right? Like if I hadn't had as honest of a horse, that could have been dangerous. So that's where that endurance piece comes in as well. And then we look at mobility, which is the difference between mobility and flexibility a little bit is flexibility is how far you can passively move your joint versus mobility is how far you can actively move it. So for example, I can pull my pinky back this far, but I can only actively move it that far. So that's my mobility and that's my flexibility. And mobility is a little bit more important in the saddle because it's not just like, can we sort of force our joints into place? It's like, can we actually control them when they are there? Do we have enough hip mobility to wrap our legs around? Do we have enough back mobility to allow our pelvis to move with the horse? All of these things, right? The last piece here is power, which is strength times speed. It's not just can you move and create force, but can you create force quickly, right? And that comes into play a lot in eventing because we have to be able to move our body forward and back and react very quickly to big jumps, drops, a horse stumbles, they catch a little bit as they're coming into the water, all those things. And the last piece is skill. And I always say this is the piece that we can't train in the gym. We can't train it really in any other way, right? This is your timing. This is your feel. This is your aids. This is your ability to kind of read the energy of the horse underneath you. And like, are they all squirrely like a bag of snakes or are they really relaxed? And be able to respond to those things. That is something that just takes hours in the saddle. But the rest of these pieces are all things we can train. And that's what we're going to dive into. So why do we actually need to train? And this is a big one. Like, I could go on an hour just for this piece. And really, it's just that a big component of it is that riding is not hard enough to make you fit enough to ride. And I know that sounds a little silly because you're like, well, if I'm riding, then I'm obviously successfully riding. But it comes down to, what are we trying to accomplish when we are resistance training or strength training or weightlifting in the gym? And what does riding accomplish? In order to actually drive adaptation in our bodies, from a muscle perspective, tendons, bones, ligaments, cardiovascular, all of these things, we need to apply what's called progressive overload, which means if this is what your body is capable of, you nudge right up to the edge of it, and then your body goes, oh shit, I guess we don't really have enough capacity for that, and it makes you a tiny bit fitter. And then you nudge right up to that new line, and then it makes you a little bit fitter. So you have to constantly be pushing yourself a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And riding, for most of us who have been doing it for a long period of time, it kind of lives within a window. Like, you've got some easy rides and you've got some harder rides, right? You've got your hacks and you've got your cross-country schooling sessions. But at the same time, they both kind of like live in a window where most of us are pretty comfortable. Like, yeah, that first cross-country schooling session, like the one with Katie coming up at Wits End, most of us are probably going to feel our fitness a little bit when you go out for that. But the problem is, once you kind of adapt to that, like, you're not really pushing yourself further until you get to a competition or something that is like where it smacks you a little bit in the face, like it did with me at that Dream Crest competition, where it's like, oh shit, I'm not actually as fit as I need to be. So that's the progressive overload piece. The other thing is hypertrophy and strength gains. Like I said, they require nudging right up to the edge, working close to failure. And that is, I don't know about you, not something that I want to do in the saddle. Like, I don't want to be pushing right to the limit of what I'm capable of when I'm riding. That does not sound like a safe activity to me. I don't want to be like right on that physical limit for myself. And so it's very hard to like push yourself to that level when you're riding. We want to be doing that in a more controlled manner where we can have appropriate dosage and appropriate progression so that we can push our body in a way that's not unsafe, right? The other thing is that riding, most of us have probably noticed this, is repetitive. And a lot of us are going to have compensations that unfortunately don't get addressed in the saddle because they just kind of like compound, right? And so we need to be able to like separate ourselves from the stimulus of riding to sort those things out. And the last thing is just like targeting the things that we don't touch on in the saddle. A lot of the time you can get away with a lot of stuff in the saddle. You can get away with not using your body in the ways that ideally we would otherwise, right? Not engaging the muscles that we would like to engage all the time. Our brain is really smart. Our brain is always like, our nervous system is always going to find the easiest way to accomplish a task. So in the saddle, if it's like, I can do this without turning on the glutes, it's gonna. And so we need to figure out ways to stimulate these other muscle groups that don't always involve the saddle. And I bring it back to this, where it's like, riding is that skill practice. We need it. We're never going to become riders without riding. Like, we have to get those hours in to get good. But if you are limited by your strength or your mobility or your physical capacity in any way, then you're going to be limited in how fast you can build that skill, right? You're just going to be butting up against a wall because you're not fit enough to build the skill that you need to build. The other piece I look at is building a buffer zone. And there's another trainer in the UK, his name is Gus Olds, and his like phrase that he likes to use is to over-engineer the system. And I love it, so I'm stealing it here. But essentially, if we looked at something like this, where this little dotted line represents what it takes to be an effective rider. Obviously, this is going to move up if you're competing at a 5-star, and it's going to move down if you're competing at like, you know, an EV60. But if this is the arbitrary, what does it take to be an effective rider at your level? And rider 1 here only rides. Their body is only going to adapt to the level of what they're asking of it, which means they do not have a lot of surplus capacity on top of what they're asking of their body in the saddle. Rider 2, they're doing all of this off-course training. They're showing up in the gym. They're working on their aerobic system. They're building all of this stuff. They now have this wonderful amount of physical surplus, where this is what it takes for them to be effective on a day-to-day level. But if their horse spooks and suddenly they need this much, guess what? They're still within that buffer zone. Versus why rider one would be overwhelmed by that ask. Rider one might be at risk of injury, right? So you look at these two things and it's like, who's going to be the softer rider? Who's going to be the more confident rider? Who's going to sit that spook better, right? Who's going to recover better if they have a hard session? And if, you know, like, excuse my French, but shit hits the fan, right? Who is going to be at risk of injury and who is probably going to come out the other side of that a little bit better? Right? I don't care who you are. This sport, it's not safe, right? We're riding 1,000-pound flight animals with minds of their own, fast, far, and high. So the more of a buffer zone we have, the more physical capacity that we have, the safer we're going to be and the better we're going to perform. The last piece I always touch on when it comes to like why we need to be considering our own training, we need to be athletes, is stewardship, right? We are stewards of the sport. We are stewards of the horse. We are athletes in a partnership, and that comes with a certain level of responsibility. And this is probably the point that, to be honest, I get the most flack about on social media when I try and bring it up, right? Our horses are showing up for us largely without complaint, but also largely without choice, right? And like, I'm not here to get into the sort of the ethics of it. Like, I am a rider, I am a horse owner, I have competed many times. That's not the point of this. But it's essentially like they're showing up for us. We owe it to them to not use them as our gym, to not use them as our fitness medium. We should be showing up already physically prepared, already strong, already mobile, already warmed up and ready to go, so that when we get into the saddle, it's about them and it's about the skill and the partnership. It's not about us being limited by our fitness, right? The other couple things is just like general capacity. This is not something that we build well in the saddle. I've already touched on how that is limited, how we're kind of like not pushing ourselves hard enough, and how it's actually kind of sketchy to think that you would want to push yourself to that level in the saddle. Sorry. The other thing is just, for most of us, we only have so many hours that we can ride, right? Saddle time is valuable. We're not out there, like, for the vast majority of us, riding 5, 6, 7 horses a day. And so it shouldn't be our primary conditioning tool. We should be trying to build ourselves up so that when we show up, we can just work on the skill piece. So now we're going to dive into like, how do we actually do that? We've covered a lot of the why there and my kind of like big points. And a big barrier that a lot of you identified in that sort of pre-workshop survey was just knowing what exercises to do. Like, a lot of you were kind of saying, I don't know where to start. I don't know what exercises to do. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on here. But this is a little pyramid that I like to use to demonstrate like where those big rocks are, where those big needle movers are, and maybe the things that get overhyped a lot and aren't as necessary. The big base here, no matter who you are, is consistency, right? I don't care if you're doing Pilates or yoga or YouTube workouts or some app that you found online. I'm going to have my, complaints with all of them in terms of like different things that they're good for, different things that they're not good for. But the first rule is just you're doing something. And ideally, that's something that you enjoy, and that's something that you can show up for on a consistent basis. That doesn't mean that you're like never missing, that you're showing up every single day without fail. That's not what consistency means. But consistency kind of means that you are showing up in a way that 10 years from now, you are still showing up. 15 years from now, you are still showing up. And if going to a gym just doesn't do that for you, and you're like, I can't get over it, like there's no way that I would be comfortable still going to the gym on that regular basis, then do the Pilates or do the yoga or do the YouTube workouts. It doesn't matter. If you're not being consistent and showing up on a regular basis, whatever that looks like for you, whatever that looks like for your life, then the rest of this up here, this is just fluff, right? So that's kind of number one. We're not going to dive into a lot of like the habit building stuff. I do really recommend James Clear's Atomic Habits is a really good resource for that. If you're looking for like a book on how to build uncomfortable habits, but that is kind of number one. Number two is like, okay, we've checked the box on consistency. We're showing up pretty good. We're showing up once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, and we're doing that on a pretty regular basis. Like 8 out of 10 times, I check that box. Great. How do we make it better? Then we start looking at appropriate exercise selection. So it's not just that I'm showing up consistently and doing something. It's like, can we optimize this a little bit more? Can we pick the right exercises? And this is where we're actually going to be focusing most of our time today. Right. Then we get into a little bit like more nitty gritty stuff. And this is more like exercise science or kinesiology, or, you know, if you ever get into like strength and conditioning textbooks, like this is where we're getting more into that nuance of appropriate volume and intensity. Volume just being like sets and reps. How much volume are you lifting if you multiply like the weight by the sets and the reps that you're doing? And intensity being how close you are to that failure point. Right? So if a 10 out of 10 is, I could not lift this weight another time, we should be somewhere in that like 7 to 9 range most of the time, which is harder than people think. Like often the weight starts to feel hard at like a 5. And then you can crank out another 4, 5, 6 reps. And then it's like, then you're properly in your, you know, uncomfortable pushing the limit zone. And most people need to kind of experience that. But that is the pushing the limits. That's the intensity piece that we're talking about. Then we're getting really into the nitty gritty of like, how are you ordering your movements within your workout? Can we optimize the way that these exercises are actually like the order that we're doing them in? And then this is going to surprise some people. Form is right up at the top, because it's often like people feel, and this is something that like social media has definitely exacerbated, that people feel like if they don't do an exercise right, they are at risk of hurting themselves. And interestingly enough, the research just doesn't support that. Like, and we'll get to this in one of the Q&A questions, but you can lift pretty ugly, and as long as you progress it slowly, you're going to be okay, right? It's maybe not optimal, like you're maybe not getting as much out of that exercise as you could, but you're unlikely to hurt yourself as long as you're taking that progression slow. So if we're diving into like the appropriate exercise selection here, we're going to get another pyramid, because I like the pyramids, guys. I like the representation of it. Where do we actually start? Like with anything, we are starting at the bottom, right? The things that matter the most, the heavy hitters, checking these boxes before we move up to the things that matter the least. And a lot of the time we will dive into this. People like to start at the top of the pyramid. And honestly, the physiotherapy profession is quite bad for this as well. Where like social media or like different clips, YouTube videos, you know, even just like common knowledge type stuff will tell you to start up here, when realistically, we should be starting down here. So if we're actually starting at the base, what do we need as a human? I always look at it like, if we take away, like we strip away everything about you, we strip away your age, we strip away your gender, we strip away your job, we strip away your sport. What would I give you to make sure that you could still get yourself off the toilet in 95? That's kind of the base level. Like if you kept doing this amount of exercise or these exercises, you would still be able to live independently in your 90s. You would still be able to get up and down the stairs. If you fell, you wouldn't break a hip. You'd still be able to get up. That is kind of the threshold that we start here. And this is what we call the Canadian Activity Guidelines. Honestly, the WHO also has their activity guidelines. The American Health Association also has their activity guidelines. They're all the same, because this is evidence-based in research, where they basically draw a curve where they say, okay, if this is like your risk of dying and or getting sick because you're not strong or fit enough, and then, you know, this is the amount of exercise you do, we draw a curve within that. There's an inflection point on that curve where a little bit of exercise gives you a very big risk drop, and then a lot more exercise doesn't actually give you that much more benefit. And this is what they have found is that inflection point. Looks like about 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic activity per week. So getting breathless, getting your heart rate up. And this is the big one that a lot of people miss. 2 times a week of strength training, targeting all your major muscle groups, and ideally taking close to that failure point, right? For a lot of us, our riding does tend to count to the 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic activity. It's physical activity. Our heart rate's getting up. Like we're getting a little breathless. But unfortunately, for all of those reasons that we discussed before, riding does not count as strength training. It's just not hard enough. It's not pushing us to that physical limit that's actually going to drive strength adaptations. So what does this 2 times a week strength training targeting all the major muscle groups look like? I know as soon as I say like all the major muscle groups, a lot of you are probably visualizing like bodybuilding movements where it's like, I got to do bicep curls, and then I got to do triceps, and then I got to do calves, and then I got to do back. You do not. You would be in the gym for hours if you tried to split it up that way. I look at a lot more like, what are the foundational movements that if we did all of these on a regular basis, we would cover everything, right? And that looks like some sort of squat, which covers your glutes and your quads, some sort of hinge, which is like your low, it's like a deadlift or a hip thrust style movement. So that's like your low back and your glutes and your hamstrings, what we call the posterior chain. Some kind of push for your upper body. So you're like pushing away or pushing overhead, right? Shoulders, chest, all those things. Some kind of pull. So you're either pulling down or pulling something towards you. So that's like upper back, shoulders again. Some kind of lunge. So we're getting like one leg at a time, unilateral. We're working on those asymmetries. And some kind of like a carry or a core. Carry, just like a farmer's carry, where you've got a weight in each hand and you're just walking around, ideally to like heavy enough that it's hard, or just core exercises, right? And then thinking about those in terms of planes of motion, something that's like front to back, something that's side to side, something that's rotational. And you don't have to do all of those at once. We can rotate through. But if you worked through these kind of 6 big movements, what would happen is that you would probably get like 80% of the way there. You wouldn't need a lot more. Sorry guys, my lights just went out because I've got a timer on my thing. Let me just turn my lights back on. I'm just gonna, there, hopefully that's a little bit brighter. Yeah, so you would be 80% of the way there, right? We don't need to necessarily go to these top bits of the pyramid. If you're doing nothing right now, this is kind of where you start. This is all you need. And so what does that look like? Here's an example of how we could make like a 2-day a week covering all your major muscle groups workout, right? The blocks here that I'm referring to, these would just be like 4 to 6 week cycles. So this would be like you would do these 2 workouts for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you would rotate and do these 2 workouts for 4 to 6 weeks. So if we were just starting from the very base, right? We have a day 1 and we have a day 2, ideally hitting these both at least once a week. Some kind of squat, like a box squat, holding a dumbbell. Some kind of hinge, like a Romanian deadlift with dumbbells. Some kind of push, like an overhead press. Some kind of pull, like a bent over row. Some kind of lunge, we've got a curtsy lunge here, and some kind of core exercise, dead bug, right? If you just did these, taking it to a heavy enough level, you would be checking all those boxes. You would be doing pretty good. If you did that consistently until you were 90 years old, I would say you would be pretty confident that you could still get yourself off the toilet and up and down the stairs, right? And then we rotate, because you don't have to fit everything in all at once, right? Say a dead bug, which is kind of like a front to back core movement. The next block, so the next like 4 to 6 weeks as we rotate through, you do a side plank instead. That's more of a side to side core movement. We're rotating through, right? So if you kind of like did this for a month and then you switched it, and now we're doing a goblet squat, which is where the weight's in front of you, but no box anymore. We're doing a dumbbell press, right? So that's like a chest press kind of thing. We're doing a reverse lunge. So a curtsy is kind of rotational, reverse, more front to back. On day 2, a single leg deadlift. So replacing the Romanian deadlift with a single leg deadlift, a little bit different, a little bit more asymmetrical. An assisted pull-up, right? This is a horizontal pull. This is a vertical pull. And then a side plank. That's as simple as it can be to start. And these are like 15-minute little circuits that you can do. So if someone doesn't have a place to start, it doesn't need to be rider specific. You can start here, and I guarantee that will help your riding, right? And actually, so this is my training app that I host, excuse me, for the equestrian physio. And that is, I have a program called the Green Program, and it is built on exactly this. It is built on, like, there's more mobility and there's more, a little bit more rider specificity built in, but it's really this kind of stuff. It's foundational, and it's like 6 months to get you going before we dive into like more complicated workouts. So the next kind of 2 layers of this pyramid is, what do you need for like your sport or your life or your profession, right? So if we think about like a paramedic, they're going to need to be able to move potentially very heavy loads in awkward ways, right? If someone falls behind a couch or behind a toilet or on the far side of the bed and they've got to move that person, they got to pick up a heavy, awkward load in an awkward way. And so they should actually probably be practicing lifting things awkwardly, sandbags or atlas stones or things like that. An electrician probably has a lot of overhead that they have to do. So maybe they need a little bit more shoulder or upper body work kind of built into their programming. And then what do you need as riders for your specific discipline? So this is when we look at like, not just what do we need as a horseback rider, but what do we need for eventing and for your level. And the reason I've got this, like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, is that this base is still your foundation. We're not getting rid of this. We are just starting to bias the movements within this or build on top of them to satisfy these additional individual needs. This still exists. This is still your base, but it's like, okay, if you have an electrician, maybe you're, instead of giving you a lot of horizontal pressing movements, we're doing more overhead pressing movements because we know they're going to be in an overhead position more. I do that for rodeo athletes all the time. So again, we start with like, they still need pressing movements, but a rodeo athlete, a roper, for example, they get a lot more overhead stuff than horizontal stuff because they're mostly up here, right? If you are looking here and it's like you're a dressage rider, looking at the needs of that sport, it's a much more open hip angle, a lot more mobility demands. We're often riding really bigger movers than, you know, your average like warm blood or thoroughbred that's doing eventing dressage. And so they're going to have a bias towards more mobility, but they still get everything on the base of the pyramid. We're just biasing their needs. Hopefully no one's head is exploding. You guys are still with me. So then we look at, what does eventing actually demand, right? If we're kind of like building it back to this part of the pyramid, we need to look at energy systems as number one. And that's just a fancy way of saying like, what kind of cardio systems are we using? Most of you have probably heard about like aerobic versus anaerobic or lactic versus alactic. So it's like, are we in that lower level zone 2? How often are we there, where we can kind of like recover as we're exerting ourselves? And how often are we in that high intensity phase? I have a heart rate recording of myself from Grandview, like it's like 2015. It's a long time ago. I was gonna say it's like 6 years ago. No, it's like more than 10 years ago now. And I was doing the training course at Grandview and I just wore my own heart rate strap just out of curiosity. And I was like between 170 and 190 beats per minute for that whole round, which is like a zone 4-5. That is like the top, a maximal output. There's another, I've got a recording of Doug Payne. I think it was going around a 4-star or 5 stars, but it was a 4-star back then. And his heart rate, as like he was probably in his 30s back then, is up in the 180s. And if you know kind of like the math on how we calculate maximal heart rate, it is 220 minus your age is kind of a rough estimate. So if he was in his 30s, so it's 220 minus his age, his max heart rate would be around 190. And he spent his entire time on that like 10-minute course in the 180s. So there are very high intensity bursts that we need to cover here. And if you're not preparing for that, then you're going to end up like me on that Dream Crest Berlin course where you get halfway around and go, oh shit, right? But we can mimic that out of the saddle. We can mimic those demands out of the saddle. And we can look at the movement patterns, right? So what muscle groups are we using and how do we replicate that? Lots of quads, lots of like the front of your thigh, which is going to stabilize your lower leg down those big drops, coming up down off the backside of the jump, absorbing the sitting trot, keeping your lower leg in place. Lots of posterior chain. I know everyone likes to go core, core, core. It's all about the core in riding. It's not. It's more about your glutes and your hamstrings. But at the same time, it's about everything. Like you do still need your core, obviously, but everyone likes to obsess about the core, and really your posterior chain, so your low back, your glutes and your hamstrings, the things that help hold your body back, those are the big things. Because if you think about it, the horse is basically trying to accelerate you with every step that they take, and you're trying to absorb that motion. And so in order for you to do that, the backside muscles of our body need to be really strong. So lots of squats, lots of deadlifts, lots of hip thrusts, those kinds of things are very important, right? Upper back to be able to keep ourselves tall, and then mobility through all of these areas also to absorb the movement of the horse coming through. Then we look at the force demands, right? How often are we sort of sustained repetitive low load? So like sitting a trot, canter, regular dressage lesson, flat work, that kind of thing, versus how often are we having to deal with a sudden high load that we have to react to, a spook, a drop, a sudden change in direction, a rollback, something like that. And so we're trying to mimic the proportions of these things that we're exposed to in the saddle. We're trying to mimic those in our gym training. So for example, a barrel racer, I would give them a lot of like fast power lateral work stuff. Same with like cutting riders, because they have to handle a lot of those fast cutting changes of direction. Barrel races have to handle a lot of that fast rotational forces. Eventers still get that, but not to the same degree. Show jumpers also still get that, but not to the same degree. A show jumper has to handle like fast rollbacks, but not quite as tight as that 3-meter turn that the barrel racer has to do. So you can see how that starts to feed into how we would proportion those kinds of movements for one discipline versus another. And the last piece we look at is just like, what are the common injuries, right? Riders, especially masters athletes, lots of low back pain, lots of hip pain, lots of knee pain, oftentimes some neck stuff or concussion stuff, or even just upper back stuff. These are very common. And so we want to, I hate the term bulletproof, but we want to try and like prepare these areas as best we can to be resilient in the face of the sport, in the face of what we're asking them to do. So lastly, we come into this, what do you need as an individual? And this is where potentially working with a qualified professional to help tailor your training to you and to your individual situation may be useful. That said, you can see like the bottom of the pyramid here, even this base of the pyramid, it still gets you like 80 to 90% of the way there. This, if you're doing nothing, you start down here. But if you're trying to optimize, you're trying to squeak out the next 10%, 15%, 5% at the top, that is where squeaking out what your own individual impairments, weaknesses, things that you need to work on do matter a little bit more. And again, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're still looking at what is the base of this pyramid, what is the base of the program that we've built. And as we look at this top piece, it's just how do we bias what we're prescribing a little bit more to address your individual needs. So for example, I've got an endurance rider that I'm working with. She's dealing with some knee pain at the moment, and she's actually great. So she does like ride and tie events. So she'll like run 20 miles in a 50-mile race because her and her partner both like just trade off on the horse. And so she's fine. Her knee's fine running. It's painful riding. And what that kind of tells me, and what the theory that we're working on it with, is that like the difference between running and riding, a lot of it comes down to, because they're both kind of repetitive motion, repetitive impact events, especially for endurance, because you're just rising trot. There's not a lot of finesse there. But it's rotation, because as soon as she's having to like straddle the horse, her knees and her hips have to rotate in a lot more, versus running, it's just straight up linear. So she is getting more kind of curtsy squats, more like crossover step ups onto a box, more things that are provoking her knee rotation and working on her strength through knee rotation to help build that. She's still getting lunges here. She's still getting unilateral leg work, which is going to help with all of her sport specific demands, and the running piece. She's still getting calf work and quads and all of those things. But we're biasing towards that rotational knee demand here, because that's the thing that she's found is painful. So that's a little bit, if you guys can picture, like that's kind of the thinking that goes on when we're trying to prescribe these things. Because you can't just keep stacking extra exercises on, because a person's program is then going to be 1,000,000 hours long, right? We have to start to get intelligent about, okay, she needs some sort of unilateral leg work, she needs some sort of quad work, but she also needs knee rotation. And then we try and pick an exercise that's satisfying all of those things. For you guys as an individual, this is what we call a needs analysis. If you ever look up any like the strength and conditioning sort of textbooks, it's essentially, we're looking at this in two parts. What does the athlete bring, and what is the sport demands? So we looked here at the sport demands. That was part one of the needs analysis. Part two of the needs analysis is, what does the athlete bring to the table? So we're looking at, what is your training and injury history, right? Have you been training in a gym for 10 years and you're super comfortable with machines and squats and barbells, and I don't need to, like, I can give you more complex movements? Or are you just starting out? And maybe we need to work on a lot of that foundational stuff first. An injury history, like, do you have a back that likes to get spicy if you go a little bit too fast? Maybe we have to go a little bit slower for that. Do you have a history of shoulder arthritis or hip arthritis that we have to take into consideration? Maybe you get a little extra dose of hip mobility because you've got a stiff hip. Maybe you sprained your ankle 20 years ago and it's never quite been back to the same. So you're getting an extra dose of ankle stability exercises in there, right? Then we're also testing to see what is your current strength and mobility and aerobic capacity, right? And we are obviously not going to prescribe super far beyond what you're capable of, but we're also not going to prescribe super below what you're capable of. We're going to try and find something that's like nudging you right up to the limit of what you can handle. And then we look at your life load, right? Like if you've got a newborn at home and you're riding 3 days a week and you're working 45 hours a week, your life load's very high. So we're going to be like very minimal in sort of the exercise. We're going to be getting like as much of a bang for our buck with a very small dose as possible. Versus if you're retired and you're like riding a couple days a week and you don't have a lot of external demands and you're like, yeah, I could work out an hour a day and that would be great. Obviously we would build up to that, but we would be able to give you a lot higher volume. And then your goals too, right? Like if someone just wants to ride for fun and pleasure and they don't necessarily need to get into the super nitty gritty of things, that's going to change versus someone who is like, very specifically, for example, I struggle with left to right lead change. And they're like, for some reason, that left to right lead change always gets me. And I really, really want to work on that. We're going to build more things in towards those goals. When we bring this back to the master's athlete piece, right? That is where we start to also look at these individual considerations and biasing the top of someone's program to help address these things a little bit more. Muscle loss is a big one. And unfortunately, that starts in your 30s, but it is kind of this downward slope. And what we're trying to do is make that slope as shallow as possible. Someone who is not doing any kind of resistance training, that slope is going to dip off fairly quickly into their 50s, 60s, 70s, versus someone who is doing resistance training, that slope is very, very shallow. And so that is why we do it. We're not necessarily stopping muscle loss, but we're trying to slow it down as much as possible so that when you get into your 90s, you still have a functional amount of muscle, right? Bone density. This is a big one, especially for those assigned female at birth. It's great. Estrogen likes to leave us at some point in our lives, and bone density is often the thing that takes a hit. A lot of the time, impact exercises like to get the highlight for bone density because people are like, oh, stomp your feet going up the stairs or wear a weighted vest to go jogging. And those are all great things. But people also don't realize that muscles pulling forcefully on a bone also stimulate bone density. So yes, impact exercise is great. But if you can squat heavy or heavy relative to what you're capable of, deadlift heavy, bench press heavy, those big muscle groups pulling on your bones are also stimulating your bones to hang on to that calcium and that density as much as possible. So we're trying to actually work on that. We are keeping an eye on recovery because a lot of us also, for women in that perimenopausal, postmenopausal stage, recovery can take a hit, right? We don't just like spring back from things, which means we need to be a little bit more judicious in how we introduce new things like exercises. We maybe need to like ramp up a lot slower than you would for someone who's 20 and 30. And we need to maybe give yourself a day or two between sessions, especially harder sessions. And so how you schedule things out across the week start to matter a little bit more. And then just keeping in mind how the hormonal side of things, especially for us women, tend to change. But men too, right? Like testosterone also starts to go down and that will affect energy. It will affect sleep. It will affect tissue resilience. It will affect how fast your muscles and your tendons and your bones can adapt. And so it doesn't mean that we don't do things. And it also doesn't mean that you're not going to respond, because the beautiful thing about being biological, we never lose the ability to adapt. We can always get stronger. But at the same time, being judicious to listen to our bodies as we're introducing exercises or new stimuli to allow that recovery to happen sufficiently between these bouts. That's kind of where we're at. So coming to this is, you guys are welcome to scan this QR code. And if you don't have your phone handy, don't panic. In the replay email that I send out tomorrow with the link to the replay, I will have all of these links as well. So if you don't have your phone, that's fine. But this is just a little handout kind of thing that I put together to help riders identify what their individual impairments are. So it's just, I called it the symmetry screen. It's nothing fancy. It's just a collection of tests, mobility tests and strength tests that you can do for yourself. No equipment needed. You just need a chair. So I guess that is a little bit of equipment, but it helps you kind of screen all those big muscle groups that we just talked about and see left compared to right. How are you faring, right? If your left is getting only 50% of what your right is capable of, bit of a flag. I also have some floor thresholds in there for what I want people to be able to accomplish. So it'll kind of tell you one of them is like a single leg. So with one leg, getting up out of a chair and down as many times as you can in 30 seconds. And there's some baseline thresholds for that for people just to this, kind of my standards based on evidence and my clinical experience for what I think riders should be able to handle. So that's there. You guys are welcome to scan that and download that, totally free. The last little piece here is that prehab/rehab. And it's at the top of the pyramid. And a lot of you might be going but you're a physio. Why is the thing that is literally your bread and butter at the top of this pyramid? And the reason being is that if we address these things well, often this becomes a non-thing, right? If someone has a rotator cuff injury or pain, often if they're doing consistent upper body lifts, it tends to get better. If they have knee arthritis, if you're squatting and lunging regularly within the limits of what your knee is allowed, and then progressing that over time, often that muscle building plus that movement will treat your arthritis for you. We don't necessarily need special knee arthritis exercises if you're squatting regularly down here and lunging regularly. Someone with chronic low back pain, same sort of thing. There's a lot of research to say that just general strength training does not outperform special rehab exercises. So I always look at it if I'm starting with someone from the ground up, I want to get the bottom of this pyramid as best I can, identified and sorted first. And then if they're still having issues, then I start to bias more towards these things. So I gave that ankle sprain example a little bit earlier, where it's okay, someone has this ankle sprain that is still impacting them 10 years later. Yeah, if this stuff is not enough to address it, I might layer in a little bit more ankle stability and ankle mobility exercises into their program. But if all of this stuff is enough to kind of, treat their ankle, then I don't need that. So that is why it kind of sits at the top there. So this is where we're circling back. So that sort of 3 exercise program that I gave you at the very beginning, that example, this is kind of what it can turn into once we start layering in those pieces. Now, keep in mind, this would be based on someone telling me what they are capable of. So someone who says, hey, I can do 2 days a week, about 45 minutes, and this is the equipment that I have available, I would build something around those constraints. But if I was just creating a general program, this is kind of what it turns into, where this is actually an example from my the program that I built out for the training app that I host, the Eventer program. But this is 2 days a week out of the novice Eventer program, where it starts with mobility needs. So for example, we've got some hip mobility here, some upper back mobility here, some low back mobility here, and some more hip mobility here, because those are just really prominent things for eventers. And then we're getting into more power, because eventing requires a lot of power. So it's a depth drop, which is basically where you just fall off of a box and catch yourself, which makes sense because we have to kind of do that same thing if we're coming down off of a drop or a backside of a jump. We have to catch ourselves and absorb that force. So that's what we're trying to replicate here. Kettlebell swing, same kind of thing. If you can visualize that, you're generating power out of your glutes and your hips. So you're generating power through your posterior chain to bring your body back and swing that kettlebell up. Guess what? Working on power in those muscle groups is what helps you get your body back quickly if your horse spooks, if you're coming down a drop, if you're doing any of those other kinds of things. Then we're getting into just the max strength, right? Some back squats, some Romanian deadlifts, some other overhead presses, some rowing, and then some accessory work. So these are the things that are a little bit less important. So they come later in the workout, something like a star side plank, which works your outside hip muscles, some butterfly sit-ups to work your core, some single leg calf raises to work your ankle mobility and your calves, and some curtsy step downs. Right? And this is just one example. We would not do this to the end of the earth. We would probably repeat these workouts for 4 to 5 weeks and then maybe rotate through different things. But you can see how the base stuff that we still talked about still exists here. Those 6 foundational movements: squat, hinge, push, pull, lunge, and then some core work, right? Those all exist here. And then we're layering on these additional movements for the needs of the sport and for the needs of the individual, right? And that is that's the way that we build it. Feel free to take a picture of this if you want, but I will give you some more examples on the next slide. So another QR code, again, I will send this out tomorrow if you want, but this is essentially some different examples of different workouts. I've got some jumper programs in there. I've got the introductory green program, an example workout from that in there, an example from the eventer workout in there, an example from the dressage program in there, and the rodeo program, I think. But this is just a free download. You guys are welcome to scan the code or use the link that I send out tomorrow for it. And it just gives you a little bit of an examples of how all of those concepts that we just talked about, how that gets put into like a program that actually is usable at the end of the day and isn't completely overwhelming. Last little piece, just a shameless plug. This is what I do. So if you guys find that, you know, you've been listening for the last 40 minutes and you're like, feel like you were just drinking from a fire hose, that's okay. That is why I have laid it out for you in this system. So it's an app, a platform where I have these programs already built out based on the bottom rungs of all of those pyramids, right? The only thing that this app doesn't really have is those super individual needs. But that said, I have built out the programs based on what a lot of riders, like the common issues that I see that pop up a lot. So it is kind of biased towards your individual needs as well. But this is basically, it is that base of that pyramid. So satisfying your basic level stuff all the way up to your sport specific level stuff. The programs are 12 months. It has that periodized and progressive structure. There's also video demos. So if you are concerned about like form or, you know, you need help, there's lots of instructions. There's also forums, like community forums within that, where you can submit videos of either your riding or your lifting for feedback. And I do this as like an open and closed door kind of enrollment system. It is like progress at your own pace, but it's more just for me onboarding people that I run it in this sort of open doors. So the doors are actually opening again April 13th, and they will be open for a week. So if you want to be the first to know, if you want to have early access, just go ahead and scan this code and you will get all of the notifications once those doors open. Cool. How's everybody doing? I love that Brittany's like taking this all to heart. No, it's okay. I wasn't calling you out. I was like, she's literally embodying it. Look at this. Okay. I'm just going to dive into some of those questions that you guys have already submitted, and then we'll open the floor to everybody. So this was actually a really great question. Approaching the topic of strength training with students who need to improve their position or stability, but just don't want to do it. Right? Because we've all been there. And like I said, getting that consistency piece is really hard. And especially when it's not something that is ingrained in our industry yet. It is not something that is just automatic, the way that, you know, like someone signs up for a hockey camp, they expect there's going to be dry land and weight room training. Someone signs up for a soccer camp, they expect that. Horseback riding just doesn't have that as part of the industry yet. And that's something that I would love to change, but it's a slow burn. The big thing I think is just touching on all those points that we talked about at the very beginning. Is that like riding itself is not enough. It doesn't provide enough stimulus for the strength adaptations that we need to be effective riders. It's not progressive enough. It's not targeted enough. And it reinforces those compensations and asymmetries that we're trying to clear out. It is for the skill component, but it is not for all of those physical components. It's not enough for that. The other thing I might bring up is just like safety and effectiveness, right? Remember, the body is going to only adapt to what you ask of it. So thinking back to that like bar graph where I had like rider 1 and rider 2, if rider 1 only ever rides and something happens that pushes them over their limit, they are at risk of injury, they are at risk of falls, they are at risk of making their horse kind of make up for their failures. And so that is the piece where I bring up like the physical component of it, where riding is not enough stimulus to build those systems, and also the stewardship component of it, where it is a partnership sport and we have a responsibility to the horse, the same way that we ice their legs after a gallop session and we bring them in and, you know, make sure that we check their whole girth area so that there's no mud there, so that they're not going to get girth galls, right? Those are part of being a steward of the horse. But I also think framing it like, framing it as our responsibility to the horse to show up as competent and fit partners for them is also part of that stewardship journey. So that's kind of how I bring that one up. This was another great question, where it's just like, should we train our weaker side more if we're asymmetrical in the saddle? And I can see why you would think that that would be a good idea. Because it makes sense. It's like, oh, if it's the weaker side, I should probably do more with it. But realistically, yes and no, for two reasons. One, I tend to draw it out like this. I really like these graphs and pyramids, so that's what you guys get. But again, if this is the line of what it takes to be an effective rider, let's say rider 1 does have a left to right difference where they're asymmetrical. And rider 2 also has a pretty substantial left to right difference. However, rider 1 has their left side is not quite strong enough and their right side's just a little bit stronger for what they need in the saddle. Versus rider 2, both sides have plenty of surplus for what they're doing. Who is going to have that asymmetry show up more in the saddle? Rider 1, right? Because rider 2, yeah, they have an asymmetry, but they're never actually in a zone where that asymmetry matters for the most part in the saddle. Yeah, it might pop up a little bit here and there if maybe they're tired or, you know, like doing something that's a little bit more strenuous, but really they're mostly operating in this zone where both sides are on equal playing fields. Versus rider 1, they're at the very limit of what they can handle. So they're probably going to notice that asymmetry a lot more. And this is, again, another just like why we need to build that physical capacity, because it is building up so that we have that buffer zone, so that if you have an asymmetry, because we're humans, we're going to be asymmetrical. Our goal isn't to like avoid asymmetry at all costs. It's to make it not matter in the saddle, right? We cannot be perfectly symmetrical because we're just like, we're born asymmetrical. We have a dominant side. We have a preference for movement. We probably have a slightly longer leg or a slightly longer arm, or, you know, one eye that's like in a slightly different shape or position than the other one. That's normal. The goal is that we build this surplus so that in the saddle, it's not showing up. That's kind of where I don't think we need to train our weaker side more. We just need to train the whole system so that everything has that surplus. I hope that makes sense. Also, if you guys notice, this is the QR code for the door prize. I'm sure you were probably reading, so you noticed it. But little surprise, we're actually going to give away 2 memberships. So for all of our OEA members, there's going to be a draw for you guys, all the attendees. If you scan this and enter your info, we will do a draw. Oh, yeah, Winnie?
Sorry, wrong button.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Were you
just
just trying
going to
to
do
turn
the
your mic on?
emoji. No, I was just going to do the emoji clap. I
Okay.
pressed the wrong button.
I love it. Yeah. So enter your info. We're going to do 2 draws. So that one is for all of our public attendees and one is for OEA members. So yeah, go ahead and put your info in down here, guys. So you guys have been watching me do this really ugly lift for about 30 seconds here now. And this is coming back to that form thing where someone was saying, I want to start lifting, but I'm really worried about hurting myself and I can't afford a personal trainer right now. Keep in mind that lifting form is not actually something that prevents injury. When we look at the research, and this is not just my personal opinion, this is based in evidence, what tends to be much higher, like put you at a higher risk of injury, be much more correlated with injury risk when it comes to lifting, is how fast someone progresses. So if someone is progressing too much or too fast or too soon, beyond like they're outpacing their body's adaptation, that is going to put them potentially at risk of injury. But it's not form in itself that's going to put them at risk of injury, because our body can adapt to all kinds of things. Like think about how biomechanically wrong riding is, or wrestling, or tennis. Like these are very biomechanically imperfect things that we do. And we don't think about ourselves injuring ourselves in those scenarios so much, especially something like wrestling or jujitsu, where your body's in all kinds of contorted positions. Sometimes, like in jujitsu, there's a 200-pound guy lifting another 200-pound guy in like a super awkward way. Is that wrong? Or is he just, if he hurts himself doing that, is it because he lifted the other guy wrong, or is it because his body wasn't prepared for that task? So this is what you call a Mansfield lift, which is just the ugliest deadlift that you've ever seen. And you probably look at this and go, oh my God, how are my discs not just like blowing up into the back wall? But when you look at this kind of movement, the reason I'm demoing it is because this is 95 pounds on the bar here. My top deadlift is 205 pounds. So this is less than 50% of what I am capable of. If I'm doing like a proper deadlift where I set myself up and, I'm like, organizing my body in a really advantageous way, I can lift 205 pounds. This is not very heavy for me to do. So I could actually lift it however the hell I want, and I'm probably not at risk of hurting myself. If I tried to do this with 205 pounds, that's a bad idea. I would probably hurt myself, but not because of the form thing, just because my body's not prepared to do it. So that's where, I usually just encourage people, just get started, because when have you ever been good at something that you've never done, right? If you feel awkward squatting or deadlifting or doing presses and it feels really just not great, just start light and ramp up slowly and just get the repetitions in so that you can get kind of that motor patterning under your belt, and your form will get better naturally without necessarily needing to worry so much about it. But just keeping in mind that, form is a lot more about like optimizing how our body moves, because we're kind of just an arrangement of levers and pulleys. And so we want to, if the goal is a squat, for example, if the goal is to squat the maximum amount of weight for what your body can handle, there's going to be a more and less optimal way to arrange those levers. But it doesn't mean the less optimal way is dangerous. So that's kind of how I want you to think about it. So this one, I'm just gonna, I wanted to note it just so that the person who submitted it knows that I have seen it. But I'm gonna put a pin in this for session 2, where we are going to talk about overuse injuries. And I think they specifically mentioned like barn chore injuries, but we're gonna put a pin in that. I'm gonna talk a lot about how to identify them and what to do about them. Same with these 2 questions. Again, I just wanted to note on them so that the people who submitted them know I'm not ignoring them. But managing your career around fitness goals, this is going to be session 3, guys. We're going to talk a lot about load management, scheduling, how to like balance recovery and riding and fitness and training and all those things. So that will come up, as well as the sciatica question. That's a session 2 one. So I'm going to talk about low back pain and sciatica in session 2. So stay tuned for that. Okay, I'm going to rearrange my screens again, but I'm going to open the floor. And Winnie, if you wanted to like, if there's, I don't know if there was, I wasn't really watching the chat, so I don't know if there was any questions submitted while I was talking or.
There isn't any right now, but yeah, we're open for any questions for Katie. I just feel like I'm way behind the 8 ball and I really got to start. I mean, I started like, actually, I just want to tell everybody, I actually found Katie because I had osteoarthritis on both hips for quite a few years, and then eventually I was going to get it replaced, and I went to see her in desperation, and she told me to do prehab. So I did. She helped me with strengthening before I had my 2 hip total replacement, and it was so much easier for after I had the surgery for rehab. So that's a plug for you.
Me and my wonderful colleague Donnie have been keeping Winnie in check. So feel free, guys, if you want, you can put up your hands or you can just put your camera on. If you don't want to put your camera on, you can submit any questions in the chat. If you don't want to submit it in the chat, when I send out the replay email tomorrow with the link to this video replay and all of those other QR codes that I had, if there was something that you didn't want to like bring up publicly, but you want to ask me, just reply to that email. It'll come to me and I can answer your questions that way too.
Yeah. So also to remind everyone, the next session is April 29th, also on a Wednesday, focusing on injury and pain. And then the third and final session is May 13th, focusing on recovery. So the links, for whoever has signed up, the link should have been sent to you. But, if anybody have any other questions, you can, for the OEA members, can send it to info@ontarioeventing.ca. We can always resend the second and the third link to you, because there were quite a bit of information. And also, when we first started the registration, we wanted to collect, Katie wanted to collect a lot of information regarding what, people's abilities, so that we could craft the presentation. However, if you don't want to fill in the whole bunch of, the questionnaire, that I believe that's totally fine.
Yeah, that's not mandatory, but if you have questions that you want to pre-submit, or if you don't mind, it's anonymous too. If you don't want to submit your email, like there's the option to put your name and email in there, but you don't have to.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
We have a question from Teresa. Have you dealt with tailbone injury?
Yeah, I've worked with a few tailbone injuries. Teresa, I don't know if you want to throw it in the chat. Was this related to a fall or related to something else? Because we usually treat them a little bit differently, whether it is a traumatic injury, like secondary to a fall, versus an atraumatic injury, like a chronic overuse type of thing. Like say someone decided to go out on a 100 pace and was riding in their old Passier, and it's not the best fit for them. And then all of a sudden their tailbone just got angry because they spent 3 hours in a saddle that they're used to spending 45 minutes in, right? A lot of the time, if it's like a proper fracture, it's a lot of offloading. So honestly, like using the donut cushions and a lot of like soft chairs, things like that. Roho cushions are great to really just like help manage the pain side of things. And then we honestly work a lot on just loading the structures that attach into that tailbone to help desensitize it. So pelvic floor, honestly, strengthening a lot of that, like doing your lifts and lowering and stretching, like deep squats and things that'll help like stretch out the pelvic floor. Working on the glutes, so glute bridges, hip thrusts, deadlifts, things like that, that are, again, any of those muscles that kind of insert into the sacrum and the coccyx, and progressing those below the threshold of what is going to kind of piss off your symptoms, but you're constantly wanting to like nudge into it. So we think of it a little bit like building up a callus, where if it's very sensitive and painful, whether it's post-trauma or whether it's just been irritated from some sort of overuse thing, we want to slowly kind of desensitize it through exposure. So the best way for tailbones that we have is just working the muscles that pull on it and just kind of like nudging into the symptoms, and then letting it recover, and then nudge a little bit more and letting it recover. So we're working those muscle groups, and we're working those areas to try and like build a little bit more robustness, but also like let it calm down a little bit. Hope that makes sense. That is awesome. Definitely one option. Sorry, go ahead, Teresa.
No, I said that was awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So are there any more questions?
You're welcome, Stephanie. The name of the app, so it's not available in the App Store because I host it through a third-party app. Like technically you download the third-party app, but it wouldn't be my platform. But you can find it on my website. So theequestrianphysio.ca. If you go to the rider section, it'll be like the first option there. I'll also link it in the email that I'm sending out tomorrow. So.
Yeah. Actually, thank you, Katie. That's really a lot of good information. I think the good thing is I'll probably have to watch the replay, which will be posted on the OEA YouTube channel in a day or so. But it's truly very useful. Like I think from an adult rider perspective, I mean, for myself, I always think it's too late for me to do all
these. It's never too late. I treat 90-year-olds that have like never been in a gym before and are squatting, with weight for the first time in their lives. Like it takes longer to adapt as we age, but we never lose the ability.
Right. That's great. Yeah. So I guess that's all the questions
Yeah.
we have.
Well, thank you so much, guys. Thank you for everyone who showed up tonight.
Yeah. Thank you.
And like I
Thank you
said-
so much. And
You're welcome.
I guess hopefully we'll see everybody on the 29th for the session 2.
Cool.
And
All
thank
right.
you for the Adult Rider Fund. They did the
Yes,
fundraising
thank you.
last year.
Thank you very much for the Adult Rider Fund for sponsoring this event.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Have a great
Okay.
night, guys. I will
Have
I will leave the QR code up for a couple more minutes for you guys. So
Yeah.
night, everybody.
Thank you.